to estimate and what are the ways that I am going to be reporting the cash that outflows that are coming from my business. And so when we talk about cash flow, cash out, number one thing is don't underestimate the amount of expenses you will incur. A big mistake businesses make is they don't truly identify and understand how much they're going to be using. And so if you're taking one of my entrepreneurship classes, the prelude to this assignment of doing a cash flow is for you to identify what are your expenses. We're going to be asking you in the cash flow statement, how many paper clips you're going to use? How much paper are you using? What are all your expenses? And so maybe paper clips, that may not seem like that big of a deal. But what are your utility bills going to be? What if you're 20% lower than your estimated expenses for that month? Are you going to have 20% more sales to compensate for that? And so identifying truly and getting as close as possible to our expenses out is essential. And then what we can do from that is we can develop a budget based on that cash going out. And so I always tell people, whatever you think your expenses are going to be, add 20% to it. And I tell them to add 20% for a couple different reasons. Number one, you probably didn't ask it for enough. So you probably underestimated the amount that you're going to be using of whatever it is. There's shrinkage and loss that generally we don't put in for. The other thing we're going to be looking at is the one thing I know about expenses: costs don't go down. The one thing I can guarantee is that costs are going to continue to rise. And so if you put a 20% bounce in that, you kind of cover, did I underestimate my expenses, and am I putting in for inflation or any other costs that might come into play? I always tell students and I always tell people I'm consulting with, avoid double jeopardy. And in small business world, what I call double jeopardy is estimating sales too high and expenses too low. And so if you get into this idea of double jeopardy right from the get-go, and you have your expenses too high, or your sales too high and your expenses too low, what you're doing is you're spending more money than you anticipated and you're bringing less than you thought about. And so what this does is this stretches this cash flow on both sides. And sooner or later that thing is going to snap. And when it snaps, that means you don't have enough money to pay your bills. And by not planning enough and effectively enough with your cash flow, this is why a lot of small businesses that don't make it through that first year, essentially, they ran into a cash flow issue. They didn't plan out their expenses properly enough.